Ok, alors, est-ce que tu m'entends? Coucou Carla. Je pars dans la cabine française. Moi, je suis en français normalement. Je me suis mis dans la cabine française. Est-ce que tu m'entends? En cabine française? Ok, très bien.
And it is truly a common action agenda. The last point that I would like to make, in particular coming from the Club of Rome, some of you may or may not remember that we came out with a seminal report in 1972 entitled The Limits to Growth. 50 years later, here we are, facing the tipping points of both social and environmental degradation, facing the polycrisis and permacrisis, facing the knowledge that in 50 years we did not do collectively what we should have done, which is to shift from an extractive economy to an economy that truly embraced people, planet, and prosperity at the same time. Our role as civil society is to bring truth to power. Our role is not to get sucked into a process, but to be critical friends, to be constructive, but to also demand for the needs of the people, the planet, and the prosperity that all of us want to ensure truly happens. So may I please ask you not to be complacent. All of us, it is our responsibility today as we sit here to ensure that we call upon this incredible body, the United Nations, to do the right thing for all peoples and to ensure that we can live within this finite planet that we call home. That is how I would like to open this session, to make sure that we are demanding all of us and that we truly do reflect the needs that we see before us today. So let me then ask my esteemed speakers, and we do have two which will be online, to join us in this call to action. And to start with Kizito Bianyaka, who is actually, I think, currently online to talk about the theory of change.
Hi, if you can hear me, and if you can start the video.
Okay. You want to do it? You are.
Great. Okay, so if you can hear me, I'll go ahead and get started. But it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today online. But what I wanted to share with you all is a theory of change, what Open Society is looking at, and to really charge you as you think about the proposals you have for today, but as well as for the rest of the discussion in how to go about with this reform, but also the proposals going forward for what's needed with the development of this work ahead for this year and next. And so for Open Society, we are aware, like you, that the multilateralism order is not quite fit for purpose. And we are developing a strategy and consult with partners to be able to move forward in a variety of work streams, looking at reform of the multilateral architecture, including those related to UN reform. What this means is some urgent capital investments where we see opportunities to make immediate fixes and some more patient capital investments over time. What does that look like? What's our theory of change? I think for us, same like you, we're looking at supporting the reimagining, remaking, and repairing of our multilateral system by breaking the cycle of failed reform efforts, focusing on who and how, as well as what, and forging new alliances that will bring the fight to capitals and communities. There's 5 main things that I want you to take away in how we're looking at this theory of change. First is that change must be anchored in ambitious but workable reforms. And so there's always going to be an abundance of proposals and ideas, but what we're looking at is to support efforts of big ticket changes. So, the new platforms, mechanisms, and approaches, as well as the stepping stones to achieve them, setting out what functions institutions need to drop or pare down to enable greater focus on the priorities that we're all advancing. Second is the who and how are just as important as the what. Too many reform efforts will see proposals that will end, will come at the end point and ignore the need to cultivate the political support and strategies. Also, reform efforts can be dominated by relatively small and largely, let's say, Western cohort of actors but what we can do is we should be able to leverage more of the insider and outside relationships, but also to encourage an inclusive approach to how we approach this. And keep with that inclusive approach is civil society. There's many recommendations afoot for how civil society should be prioritized within the United Nations, whether as a civil society focal point, but ensuring that the stakeholder engagement is not piecemeal, but it is meaningful. And that comes through having an inclusive process in who designs the process, but also the collaboration and alignment in doing so. Third is we can encourage action by supporting major initiatives that have legs, discerning which formal processes provide opportunities or create risks that require engagement. For example, like the Global Digital Compact, and ensuring we are ready to push through smaller changes when openings arise. Fourth is we can improve the performance of multilaterals even without formal reform. And this is important to think of through the strategic work that also will take place with leaders and governments, because we need leadership that will not only achieve reform, but ensure that that reform leads to change that happens on the ground. We can theorize and have the great plans, but what's happening in between to make sure that we take that forward? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, to the point I was mentioning around collaboration, is that it's important not to operate in silos. So while reform agendas for individual multilaterals abound, there's remarkable little focus on how they can work well together. I think there's something important for this group is to fill this gap by nurturing ideas on how issues, decisions, and actions can move through these different spaces. And by deepening informal ways of engagement, that's taking place through this meeting, but also going forward through projects and other ways that we can carry forward this collaboration. And that's especially important because, for the change that is possible, we need to be able to work together, and we need to work in concert on these big ideas and how we advance them. We need to ensure that there's a way that civil society has direct access, and there's a platform for engagement throughout the UN processes. There's a vehicle for that through this civil society envoy, but through that kind of engagement needs to be built out through everybody that's here and throughout those who are not able to attend as well. It's important that this process is as inclusive as possible, but very strategic in taking forward the priorities that we can advance to have reform, but making sure that we work together to deliver so. And so while we'll look forward to see what everybody else shares, I'm excited to hear what you all come forward in terms of the proposals. The hard work is ahead, but it's great to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimboko, and thank you for setting the frame so well in terms of the theory of change, both in terms of the inclusive approach, not to have piecemeal, to understand that actually we can shift the institutions as they are today, and also ensuring that we have more informal engagement. And speaking about bringing in a voice of the importance of the theory of change, that's the voice of the future, and in particular, the voice of youth. And so I would like to turn to Sofia Bermudez, GFF Youth Coordinator in UNESCO SDG 4 Youth Network, for a few comments as well.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. And I would like to start mentioning that something that was already mentioned in the previous panel, and it was this UN 75 declaration. In this declaration, young people is described as the missing piece for development and peace. And also, this declaration calls on truly ensuring a meaningful and proper youth engagement. And actually, last year, over every conference I've been in person, online, all the time, young people, I would say even like 90% of the times, at least just one time, they mention at their speeches the importance of ending tokenism. We don't want to be just invited to a conference, even if we're travel all around the world. We don't want to just be there. We don't want to just take a picture, that you take a picture with us. We don't want to only be consulted. We want to actually be at the decision-making tables, because we know we have a lot to give at those spaces. And we're taking care of our future, as you mentioned, as also Quisito mentioned, the importance of ensuring a collaborative space and for us to work together to create real and true changes. And even the Secretary General mentioned at the Transforming Education Summit that we need to go from the phase of consultation with young people to the phase of responsibility, a phase in which we integrate young people at the decision-making tables. And even in the Our Common Agenda, it is mentioned the importance role that young people has, and the importance that we are treated as equals, something that seems so basic, but so far away in the reality. And I think the big question, like last year, we talked a lot about ending tokenism, but the big question this year is how we're going to do that. How we're going to end tokenism, how we're going to ensure young people has a real place at the table, how we're going to ensure a proper youth engagement across these international spaces. And that the Global Futures Forum, that was the main question that led all the initiatives we thought for the youth track and across even the forum itself. We wanted for young people to take ownership of this forum, and especially to take ownership of the different initiatives we thought for youth engagement specifically. And the main things we wanted to achieve was one, a true space to showcase young people's work. Two, a real space for young people to engage, to interact with stakeholders. And also, as number three, we wanted to also try to reach more young people. I know someone mentioned it also at the previous panel, but how we can reach more young people, how we can include more people at these tables, that we have the privilege to be here to ensure that all voices are being heard. So for these initiatives and for this forum, for the youth track, first of all, we put as a priority to make an entire youth organizing team, first of all, to put young people as colleagues of each one of the youth tracks, to create this youth pavilion to champion young people's work, to make an open call to youth researchers to ensure that their work is seen in the youth pavilion, and also they have the opportunity to apply to one of the presentations of the 7 tracks that you will be hearing today. We wanted for those youth research papers to be the kickoff of each one of the tracks on the importance of that. Also, we are hosting a youth hosted youth reception. And also in this organizing team, I don't want to not mention that we count with the incredible experience, intergenerational experience, to actually achieve initiatives that will be long-term, that will be with the fresh view of that young people has, but also the incredible experience of people that has been in this field over a lot of time. so far. And last but not least, I really want to encourage all of you to really meaningfully engage with young people in these conferences, to hear from us, to hear what we think about the 7 tracks, what we think about multilateralism, and not only ask us about the youth agenda. We have a lot to say about the youth agenda, but we are also experts on our field and we have a lot to bring to the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophia, once again, for not only reminding us that youth are not tokens, but also a very important part of the intergenerational dialogue. And when we talk about the intergenerational dialogue, we have to talk about the wisdom of our elders, as well as the wisdom of our youth, and all of us in between. So it's a pleasure now to shift from youth to the importance of the regional forums. And I would like to introduce Jeffrey Hofeins, Senior Advisor for the Coalition for the UN We Need. Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. It's a real pleasure to see everyone here in the room for the first time for many of us since COVID. So first, I would like to give our sincere thanks and gratitude to our C4UN partners who have so assiduously organized and engaged 5 regional futures forums in recent months to bring critical and diverse intergenerational civil society perspectives into our preparations for the Global Futures Forum here. We will be having a regional panel tomorrow moderated by Oyebisi Babatunde of the Nigeria Network of NGOs. So I will not go into detail, but would like to make the following observations. Since our first round of regional consultations in June of 2021 that discussed priority issues on the role of civil society and the UN in each of the 5 regions globally, the second round of consultations now ongoing have deepened and complexified our discourse with the UN 75 Declaration and our common agenda in line with the deepening engagement of the UN system and member states with the multiple OCA intergovernmental tracks now in play at the General Assembly. Indeed, one can observe that members of civil society are leading the charge in many respects by interrogating without fear or hesitation the interlinkages between the OCA and the 2030 Agenda as we prepare for the 2023 SDG Summit and the 2024 Summit of the Future, and its promise to renew and strengthen the UN system, leading to the transformation of the global governance architecture more broadly, recognizing that the disturbing alternative to transformation is indeed staring us right in the face with every successive news cycle. So it is through regional engagement where we will deepen our outreach with civil society partners at the national and grassroots levels, and it is through our regional partners where we will most effectively activate our advocacy with member states to the ECOSOC regional commissions and other regional bodies down to the national level with UN country teams and their associated UN agencies and departments. We look forward to discussing with our CSO partners on our global, regional, and national advocacy strategies going forward as a part of the UN Mission Engagement Day on Wednesday morning, as we seek to connect the dots of our advocacy at missions in New York and other headquarters to national capitals, where political and financial decisions are made by national parliaments and the executive branch. Moreover, I wish to congratulate our C4UN African regional partners for taking our regional engagement to the next level with the establishment of a new partnership with the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC. And on behalf of the C4UN Steering Committee and Secretariat, it is with great pleasure to welcome our African Union ECOSOC 3-member delegation to join us here at the Global Futures Forum. Khaled Badali, presiding officer, we heard his words of wisdom in the earlier panel. William Carew, head of Secretariat, and Mr. Kiritwe Usay, head of programs. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. So immediately after the Global Futures Forum on Wednesday, while we are deploying C4UN delegations to meet with UN missions AU ECOSOC, in partnership with the C4UN Coalition, will be hosting the Africa Dialogue, bringing the voice of the African citizenry to the UN. The main objective of this activity will be to share the outcomes of the regional consultations pertaining to the African perspective to key stakeholders, including missions of the African Union member states accredited to the UN, CSOs, and other relevant stakeholders. So let me wrap up by thanking again our C4UN regional partners for their amazing work, details of which we will learn all about tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And thank you as well for making the links between the local, the national, the regional, and the international. We do have to very much join those dots and ensure that there are feedback loops across all of them. And may I commend you, as well as those online, for staying to time, which has been very effective. So I would very much like to move over now to Soon Young Yoon, UN Representative, International Alliance for Women, Feminist Framework for our Common Agenda Policy Briefing, which you are working on obviously very actively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. When I first got a copy of the OCA, I immediately searched the words women, gender equality, and sexual orientation. And I was amazed to see that women appeared more than, can anyone guess?
0 times.
55 times.
Okay.
55 times. And
For once.
was and girls as well,
Yes.
and mainstreamed throughout the report. I was also excited to see that the commitments that were mentioned this morning, number 5, urges member states to support very specific measures. And these are the recommendations we need to remember. Repeal of gender discriminatory laws, promote gender parity, including through quotas and special measures, facilitate women's economic inclusion, including investment in the care economy, which came up a great deal during COVID, and support for women entrepreneurs, including those of younger women. And finally, an emergency response plan to the eradication of violence against women and girls. So who else was scrutinizing the OCA through a gender lens? None other than Maria Fernandez Espinosa and Nutara Yusuf. So the three of us got together and we decided that the OCA had opened the door to reimagining a United Nations through a feminist lens. And with the help of partners like the GWL, Baha'i International, International Alliance of Women, and the Global Governance Network, we decided to commission expert papers. So today I'm happy to announce that a book will be published this early spring. Its purpose is to shine a light on the feminist analysis that will contribute to the ongoing debate at the General Assembly, the Summit of the Future, and other discussions such as the new Agenda for Peace. Now, I did manage this morning to print. I know that paper is valuable sometimes. So if someone can help me distribute, this will give you the list of authors. What I encourage you to do is to take a picture of that, this flyer with your phones and send it to your networks. That's why I brought the print. There's some more here as well. Oh, yeah, thank you. And there are a few in the back. So you may think that 55 references is pretty good.
Not good enough.
Not good enough. We disagree. Although the report puts gender equality and women's empowerment at the center of the UN's 3 pillars of peace and security, human rights, and development, the OCA does not fully address the all-important questions of how and by whom. So we asked the authors to cover some of these key issues. How can the feminist and women's movements influence decision-making across the UN system? on all the issues, such as mentioned this morning, financial architecture, climate justice, using an intergenerational approach. What is the state of the art in the global multilateral agenda, and how can we create synergies with women's human rights? What are the recommendations for action-oriented implementation, and where can we start? What are the UN agreements, instruments, and accountability mechanisms already in place that we can use to guide actions? The Beijing Platform for Action has the CSW. The ICPD, dealing with population and women's sexual and reproductive health rights, has UN bodies like UNFPA. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, has a 23-member CEDAW committee. And the UNFCCC on climate reports to the Conference of the Parties. The SDGs is reviewed by the High-Level Political Forum. The point is, unless we ground the OCA in these existing mandates, we cannot access the accountability mechanisms that will help implement the SDGs, and we need all of them. So when I looked at these papers, I found some common threads which I would like to share with you. In some ways, these form the beginnings of a feminist framework. First, the power of information. So Fatima Kafaji from Egypt in her paper noted that climate justice is an issue for her women for rural women who in her country only own 5% of the land, even though they are the backbone of farming. And even if they did control the land, they are not receiving information about what is actually happening in their environments. They have not a clue about climate change or how to access finance. The call for better data was also made by Sarah Hawkes and Ken Vues, who spoke of women's rights to health in their paper. They wrote that improved sex-gender disaggregated data is needed so that women have a clearer picture of the social determinants of health, which are the major cause of female mortality. You would be surprised to learn it is not, in fact, breast cancer. We are talking about heart disease, diabetes, the other cancers, and chronic respiratory ailments, as well as mental health. So this calls for a greater effort by the United Nations and by us to make information a popular public good, particularly for the most marginalized women and girls. And furthermore, all that data has to be co-created as well as shared so that we have co-creation of data from grassroots to global levels, as well as from the top downwards. Second point, there is a lack of integration of feminist leadership. We talked about different levels, local to regional. We must remember the regional to the global governance. And the authors, Eileen Burney and Letitia, examined the feminist foreign policies in Europe. And they pointed out how important a regional intergovernmental entity like the European Union can be and calls upon it to wield a stronger normative power. The power of the United Nations, I would say also the United States to some extent in their foreign policy, is normative. And regional bodies have the responsibility and the duty to put feminist foreign policy into those regional governance institutions. Another point, there is an implementation gap in the face of backlash for women. Dubrovka Simonovic, who is the former chair of CSW, former CEDAW expert, and also most recently former special rapporteur on violence against women, proposes that the emergency platform to end gender-based violence and violence against women must be seated at the CSW. She argues that since its founding, the CSW has changed from elaborating new instruments at the UN. It was responsible for CEDAW. It was responsible for initiating the process for 4 world conferences. It has now become, in her view, it has become a place which is scaling down its purpose to simply reporting on progress, weakening its influence. She argues that the wide implementation gap can be bridged by strengthening the CSW with tools for accountability, particularly bringing CEDAW much closer to the CSW.
Because we've got 3 more speakers.
Yes. Another point in the framework is what we would call intersectionality. How many of you have actually heard of this word? There you are, Dan. Okay. I have to say that the paper that was contributed by Marisa Conway in her essay has made an important point that contextualizing the feminist analysis in the class and racial institutions that oppress women are extremely important in talking about gender. It is not enough to imagine that women are homogeneous. They face multiple layers of discrimination and marginalization. And what I loved about the analysis was that it's not just a matter of data justice or being visible in the statistics. It is a matter of unveiling the power structure within which gender equality must function. And so let us think of intersectionality as related to power. The final point on their papers deals with peace and security. Peace and security for women is more than international conflict or domestic conflict. It is conflict in the home, in our community. It's violence against this. And Marisa Conway addresses this question about would the world be more peaceful if women were in charge? And she makes a very useful distinction, which I think is good for us as well, is that we open the doors for women, we open the doors for civil society in the short run, but we must also have a long-term goal, which is to change the institutions in which we must function. Not all of us are on the same side. So as we open the doors to civil society, we have to imagine reforming those institutions so that progressive social movements can move forward. I consider us in this room part of the feminist and women's movement, which I believe is the most powerful, is the most transformative, and I should say, the most wonderful non-violent social movement of our times. So let's go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sonia. And I think for 2 very key points that you've made. One, the power of the feminist movement, which by the way, should be fully integrated into every single aspect of our society and not just be a movement. Number 2, the importance of putting in place short-term levers for long-term systems change. And that is absolutely fundamental. And a point which actually came out in the work that we've been doing at the Club of Rome in terms of system dynamic analysis, where empowerment became a key turnaround to ensure that we would stop poverty and inequality and get us actually to a resilient society for all. So thank you for that. That is why actually the feminist movement is part and parcel of a changed earth for all. I'm going to pass it now to you, my dear friend, Dan, who, as you've been going around and giving everyone the microphone, you finally get it yourself. As co-chair Coalition for the UN We Need, and you're going to talk a little bit about the e-consultations and the People's Pact framework.
Thank you so much. Could I have that?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. There we go. So it's really a delight to be here with you, not just because I have such an affinity for all of you, but because it means that in 2 days, I won't have to think about the upcoming Global Futures Forum. So thank you so much. My purpose here, at least for this intervention, is just to articulate a little bit what has happened thus far and what we're hoping for in the coming couple of days. I know you've been sitting for a while, but this is hopefully the most sitting we're going to do, because then we're going to be learning from and with each other. So you are already aware of the track work that has been undertaken in the 7 tracks. And if you aren't, you can take a look at the 2-pagers, the 1 2-pager that has all the recommendations, and then 7 2-pagers that have a little bit of background and further detail. Yeah, we love our 2-pagers because it's only 1 piece of paper. Um, Thank you to Francesca. I don't know where you are. If you could give a quick wave. She's the one who put together those dynamic 2-pagers, so we're very grateful to her. And that gives you a little overview of what we've done thus far, and hopefully can launch us to what we'll do going forward. I also want to express gratitude to the roughly 21 track leads. So each track was made of 3 leads who were trying to facilitate these e-consultations, and then the 1,700 or so of you who participated in the e-consultations, which is amazing to see how much dynamism and excitement there is. And we also saw a really nice example of what collaborative competition could look like. As one e-consultation decided to supplement with a Zoom call, another one said, well, why didn't we think of that? And they had a Zoom call. As one of them had a poll, another one then had a poll. And we had this sort of race to the top, which was, I think, very exciting. And we're really happy to demonstrate that because it was collaborative and sort of learning from each other. So what we've created, what you have created, is really a wonderful array of normative background and proposed recommendations for further discussion, and more importantly, to develop a plan to move forward. One concern that we've had from the beginning is that we are really good as civil society at sitting in the back of a car and saying, you should turn left. No, you should slow down. And then when we're suddenly in the driver's seat, we don't have much to say to do. So we're trying to say, okay, how would we actually drive? No, it's not always right. But it is, I think, an example that we hear. It's a complaint we hear across the street as well. You're in the room, now what do you say? And oftentimes we say we need to be in the room. Well, now you're in the room, so what do you say? And so I think that's sort of our task before us, is to figure out what it is that we say so we can be a shining light for others to use as a guide. So the documents we've had are the results of these first steps in what we hope will be at least an 18-month, perhaps a 30-month process moving forward. And it is quite robust, but it is not sufficient. It is part of a learning process. So we have to recognize first that we must be detached from what's there, because otherwise we're not learning. Think of yourselves as scientists. If a scientist were attached to his or her assumption and didn't take in the new evidence and modify their assumptions, they would not be a scientist for very long. They would be fired, because that's not science. We have to do the same and make some proposals and test them out, speak to member states, speak to UN agencies, and hear what they're saying in response, modify so that we can actually be useful and partner. So we are asked to arrive at a set of recommendations, which could then be further explored. We have them. And as I've been saying, getting from the what to the how. So naturally, over these 2 days, there may be some tensions about whether we've landed on the right recommendations. Despite this, I'd ask that we spend our precious time together, because it's so limited, trying to chart a path forward. I see that I'm no longer there, which is probably to the benefit of our friends joining online. I'm not a fun person to look at. So anyway, there are 2 reasons that I think we should be looking forward. The first is that nothing is ever final. We travel together through iteration. And so because of that, we shouldn't spend so much time trying to get the perfect thing, but get the direction of travel under our belts. And we have to have a posture of learning. If we're not learning from each other, as mentioned before, then we're not going to be growing. So the second reason why I think we need to adopt this path forward is because we have, as I said, a direction of travel. So let's try to go far together rather than go quickly alone. As you are all familiar with that, famous African idiom, if we can take that mentality and join together and try to be in this for the long haul, rather than splintering. And I mean, you can splinter and do your own thing, but that won't be with all of us. And so we have to build that coalition. So this isn't to say that we can't discuss and iterate here, but it is to say that what we want to try to engage is articulating a path forward. So when we leave here tomorrow afternoon or Wednesday afternoon, we understand Ishan is leading the charge on thing X. And if I have any questions, I'm going to turn to him, and he's going to be bringing us together around that. And then we'll have, Richard on thing Y, and we can follow. And in this sense, it doesn't have to be all men. And in this sense, we are able to move forward with some practical steps. So this forward thing, this futures thing, leads me to what I'm most excited about for the coming 15 minutes, which is a presentation from the Copenhagen Institute on Future Studies. If you're not aware of this institute, you should do some quick Googling, but while I'm speaking, not while they're speaking, because they do a lot of work thinking about the future and trying to help us go through a series of questions about what it is that we hope for as we are trying to co-construct a better future for humanity. And I think these questions can serve us very well as we're trying to be in the right mental space, to be detached from our own previously held assumptions, and to be willing to learn and treat each other generously as we move forward. So let me then, if I could be so bold, Sandrine, if I could just introduce our colleagues, Jonas Gissel Mikkelsen, and who's the director of the Copenhagen Institute on Future Studies, alongside, I think, Nicholas Larsen is there as well, who's their UNESCO co-chair. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation, and thank you so much for joining us from Copenhagen.
Thanks for having us, everyone, and thanks for the very nice introduction, Dan. We hope we can live up to it. Sadly, we couldn't be there in person, but you'll have to get the pleasure of us here online. I think that you all got the introduction, so we've shared some of our slides. Are they shared with you?
Yep.
Yeah, you see our slides. Perfect. So I think Dan just went through quickly also who we are, just for you to Nicholas, I'm not able to do this while you push on something there. Just a second. So just quickly about the Institute, so everybody knows who we are. We are an independent futures think tank. So we were established back in 1969. That's our founder, next to someone you might know in America, to basically contribute to the betterment of society through future studies. Now, what we do is that we're dedicated to democratizing the future creation. And that basically means democratizing the process. We are coming from an age where a lot of people of influence had this, and it was very Western controlled, to trying to get it out and become a future for the many, by the many. Now, the way we do that is that we try to create knowledge and capabilities, which means sharing insights, research, and inspiration about plausible futures, but also build futures capabilities, such as terms you might have come across, such as strategic foresight, futures literacy, which is a UNESCO discipline, and anticipatory leadership. The other part we try to do and build is platform and representation. That means inclusion and engagement. It means that we're trying to create different platforms for broader societal involvement in shaping the future. And lastly, of course, the representation part, which is also a very important part of our common agenda, is representation of future generations, those not born yet. But it is also, from our perspective, representation of neglected perspectives or topics of plausible futures which are not acknowledged in the present. Some of them have already been mentioned. So yeah, essentially, the basics of thinking future. You are all about to go into your thematic tracks. And for that, you're supposed to talk about futures within these thematic tracks. To be able to do that, it would be nice to set sort of the scene, and we're trying to give you a basic introduction to how to do that, how to think futures. I'm sure Dan and Nutar and all the other organizers have shared this toolkit, this appendix that we have sent out. But just to go through some of it and set the stage for you, I brought Nicholas in here, who's going to take you through a couple of the points.
Thank you, Jonas. Now, I want everyone in the room and the people that are following online to consider these two questions on transformed thinking for just a moment, and try to open yourself up to alternatives. The questions goes like this: which of your present ways of thinking could be radically different in the future? The second question: what does the future actually ask from you? Take notice of your first response to these questions, and I prompt them because they really quickly emphasize how hard it is to both understand what change will look like in one's own environment and how important it is to cater to the needs from the future rather than one's own, and particularly in the discussions you have ahead. Now, if we look at futures and foresight at the Global Futures Forum, where everything essentially is about the future, we also need to make sure that we have the right elements, the right conversations and models present in the room to address the topic of the future in a more qualified level. Now, the purpose of futures and foresight at the GFF is not to predict the future, because no one can, but the purpose is to explore futures and use those perspectives to inform decisions or developments in policy that you will arrive at. Now, futures thinking seeks to include plausible and possible outcomes, drawing attention to assumptions and potential blind spots, as Dan just mentioned, as well as building confidence in challenging tendencies. At the same time, it's an open-minded approach that requires inclusion and diversity of different actors and stakeholders, and hence we do have a lot of potential at this forum to do some really interesting work. But by only focusing on immediate goals and concerns, we may neglect to anticipate potential long-term consequences of our actions. And this can result in decisions that may provide short-term benefits, but ultimately be very harmful. Therefore, our fundamental mindset needs to change, both in terms of the general public, the civic sector, private sector, and in governance as well. And we need to foster a more long-term approach while we're still connected to present action. This can be defined as anticipatory governance. It's defined as the systematic embedding and application of strategic foresight through the entire governance architecture, including policy analysis, engagement, and decision-making. Most public sector organizations don't have any futures or foresight capacity, and if they do, it's often insignificant. The most important thing to do now is to begin to cultivate this type of leadership, as well as the technical and practical support necessary to make considerations for the future an integrated part of policy development. This is a quote by Sophie Howe, whom you might know. She was the first Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, just ended her 7-year posting. And here she speaks to lack in public spheres. While I dare argue and extend the argument to the civic sector as well, with public and civic sectors being far behind the adoption of futures thinking in comparison to our colleagues in the commercial sectors as well. So we need a stronger link and interplay between public and civic spheres, and futures thinking, foresight, and so forth might just be that missing link. Now, I'll hone in a little bit on the different elements in the brief. It's crucial to stay mindful that there are multiple futures ahead of us, and to consider what future you find possible, what you find plausible, what you find probable, in order to be able to discuss what is actually preferable, and for whom. This can lead to new ideas, initiatives, proposals, and so forth to get us there. It's necessary to ask what is feasible versus what is necessary. And you'll perhaps find that the conversations you're having soon about the future need to be aligned in order not to be misunderstood or simply derail due to discussing different vantage points. Are we talking about what's possible or what's preferable, and to whom? While engaging with the future on an individual and organizational level is something we do all the time, we are rarely very conscious about the hidden psychological mechanisms that impact our choices here. So we want you to be aware of biases and fallacies in order to prevent perpetuation of past problems in the discussions you're having. So biases are the subconscious errors that leads us to misinterpreting information in the world around us, while fallacies are failures in our reasoning that leads to mistaken beliefs. To mitigate these things, we want you to assess through dialogue and exchange between the people in the room and bring diverse perspectives to the table. Try to be as non-partisan as possible and ask who might not be in the room. There's a few examples that I want to bring forward. There's the era of linear projection. Here we presume that the future change will be a simple and steady extension of past and current trends. This is an error because the future won't be shock-free. The second I want to present is all else unchanged. Here we have the era of considering only a few aspects of change while holding all else equal. And we forget to consider the second, third, and fourth order effects. Then we have the arrival. The era of envisioning possible futures as something that is static, as a destination or a goal. It's not about thinking up a utopian or dystopian narrative as a destination, but using our anticipatory skills and processes to lean into the future as a canvas, if you will, where we can address the issues that we have at hand and link it to present action. Then we have the era of prediction and planning, believing that it's possible to predict and plan the future. And while we have data that can project and we can do modeling, the future is per default uncertain and won't be shock-free. And lastly, we have the future of personal exemption, where we are perhaps slightly too optimistic about one's own future, despite the realistic or even dystopian take on our collective futures. We tend to front load the future with value systems and predisposed interests and subconscious beliefs. And while fallacies and biases are popular topics, it's not enough to speak about them at conferences like this. So my advice to you all in the following discussions is to delay your intuition. Sit with the uncertainty and perhaps ask, as I said before, who's not in the room. We need to be able to delay our intuition so that we don't jump straight into applying solutions, because we tend to apply yesterday's logic to tomorrow's issues. So hold on for a minute and consider if we need to depart from ideas that on closer inspection reinforce systems that are inadequate. Perhaps it's time to build something new, thought up from the perspective of the future rather than legacy systems. Soon you'll be having different topical conversations in the various tracks. Here I want you to consider if you have thought about what drives change in and around your topic or track. See if you can detect patterns of change that could have transformative impact on the subjects that you cover. This is an essential part of Futures and Foresight work that informs the evidence base and allow us to develop insight on what actually drives change and consider how it might manifest itself in assumptions, behaviors, and so forth. So we are looking from pushes, pulls, and weights. And we can do that through this very intuitive brainstorming tool called the Futures Triangle that you can use in various ways. Here we want you to consider, it says the future of the United Nations in the middle. You could also replace that with your thematic track. What barriers are there to change? Think about deep structures in society, such as cultural norms or values or traditions. What are the current trends and drivers that pushes a certain direction? Or notice novel developments, signals of change, or potential discontinuities that constitutes new images of the future or new visions. So entering dialogues going forward here at the Global Futures Forum, try to address what is currently pushing change in a certain direction, what is from history weighing you down so change can't happen, and which ideas or compelling narratives pull towards certain new futures. And to sum this up, we hope this gives you ideas and inspiration to carry on futures-informed conversations at the Global Futures Forum. And I'll leave you with a few questions here. What images of the future is it that you see? And whose future is this? What assumptions are you making about this future? What are the specific timelines and what stakeholders should be involved and sit at the table? What drives the change and what is likely to shape the future of this topic? And lastly, what actions are necessary to shape a better future, not only for ourselves, but for future generations as well?
Yes. And just lastly, a small gift from us to all participants of the GFF. This is our latest publication, and it's called Safeguarding Tomorrow, a lot about the future generations. So this is free for all of you. We'll also post a link in the chat, but hopefully this has given you sort of an idea before you go into your thematic tracks about how to think about these topics. So that's it from us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you both so very much for laying this out for us. And I think incredible
Dan, can you hear us?
methodology
We
to
can't
apply.
hear you.
Absolutely, as we're trying to think through how we can plan for the future. Taking into consideration also the papers, the 2-pagers that you all have in your brief, and thinking through the links that we're seeing right now in terms of some of those short-term levers that we're speaking about. Look at the Bridgetown Initiative, for example, or some of the introductions that we heard around totally shifting the SDRs, rethinking our trade patterns. If you look at Bridgetown and the way in which we're rethinking economic development, right now there is already a shift in thinking. And when I look through some of these papers, apologies, but I think we need to be much more critical, much more ambitious, much more bold, because actually we are seeing that there is boldness elsewhere. There is a shift right now, even in the thinking through of the COP negotiations in terms of reform, UN negotiations, and the way in which we are looking
towards the future in terms of building resilience, in terms of thinking through the perma-crisis. So let us step up to the plate. I think it's fundamental that we apply some of this thinking and question our own methodology of change as we move forward. Apologies. If I may, we now have our respondent, His Excellency Brian Wallace, Permanent Representative of Jamaica to the United Nations, that is online. And sir, if you can hear me, Your Excellency, we would love to have your reflections.
Thank you so much. It's good to be joining you. This has been a very interesting session so far, particularly the last presentation by the Copenhagen Institute. I have just started co-facilitating the process for the Declaration for Future Generations, one of the tracks under the OCA. And this is precisely what we're trying to do here in the UN system, which is to set out some guiding principles to help us to start thinking in exactly the way that Mr. Mickelson and Mr. Larson just outlined. We're not, the process right now is a consultative process, and this kind of dialogue is certainly very helpful in providing the kinds of enlightenment that the entire process will need going forward. You know, as a matter of fact, there is currently underway at the General Assembly a meeting with the Group of 77 and the Secretary General to explain some of the thinking around the Summit for the Future, which the Declaration for Future Generations is one track of. And I'm going to have to be leaving you very, very shortly to head over there to participate in those discussions. But it is encouraging to know that there is already a body of work out there that that is analyzing what needs to be done, how it should be done, what are the elements, because this is something relatively new to the UN. We speak about dealing with the problems of today. We speak about engaging the youth, but now we're starting to look at that much longer term. And bearing in mind the challenges that we face with all of what Mr. Larson just pointed out, it's going to be a challenge, but it is something that we must, a process that we must begin if we're going to make sure that we are truly future-proof. So congratulations on this very interesting, I think the words that Dan used, dynamic and exciting. And I certainly endorse that this has been exactly that. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And I think that we are all inspired by ensuring that we future-proof the future. And in particular, that we stress test ourselves continuously and our thoughts and our thinking process as we move forward, so that we truly can be bold in the way in which we put forward the 2 days of deliberations that come out. I'm actually going to attempt to close this session with a few summary thoughts. And I'd like to thank my team who have been sending me, as well as I've been going through and writing copious notes. We started off with thinking through clearly the theory of change. And the big challenge that we have is to support the reimagining, to remaking and repairing our multilateral system. And as I indicated, we are right now thinking through the multilateral system itself. There is a huge discussion around moving beyond Bretton Woods and what that actually looks like. So let's take that into consideration as we move into our deliberations, that we need reform changes at the macro level and in terms of the broader incremental short-term levers, but it is the macro long-term systems change that we are trying to achieve. The importance of the youth engagement that we heard from Sophia, not to belittle, tokenize the youth engagement, but to make it part and parcel of the way in which
we move forward in our deliberations, our recommendations, and the way in which we think through the future scenarios that we want to create. That means engagement in decision-making. That means ensuring that we have the true space for showcasing the youth's work. The way in which we address regional forums, and that we look at deepening the discussion and engagement with multiple tracks. The linkages between the local, the regional, and the global levels are absolutely critical. That civil society is interrogating the key challenges with the current multilateral system and the engagement between the regional and the multilateral. We know that, for example, in an African context or in a Latin American context, we need to have a strong regional force, one which enables greater trade and economic development across the region and between countries in the region, rather than only looking at the international dynamic. The importance of the feminist framework that must be fully integrated into our common agenda, not as a movement, but as part of the way in which we address the society of today and the future. Women's economic inclusion in the care economy, which again, as you so clearly indicated, was so important. A fundamental reminder of the importance of the care economy as being part of the economy, not a sidetrack of the economy, not a parallel economy. Hence bringing us back to what is most essential in our economy, in our financial system today, as a reminder not only of the pandemic, but also as the way in which we deal with future crises. There is a lack of integration of feminist leadership, and let us not forget that many of our feminist leaders are stepping down because of the stress, because of the difficulty, but also because of their honesty of saying short-term cycles, power, profit, versus then people, planet, and prosperity is making it very difficult for us to lead. That means we need to shift our leadership so that it becomes a leadership for people, planet, and prosperity. Then I will continue in terms of the importance of the People's Pact framework. We've had the e-consultations across the 7 tracks. We're being asked in the next 2 days to question these consultations, to bring further deliberations, depth, and analysis in those consultations. This is going to be a 30-month process moving forward. It is robust. But as you indicated, you called us to come to the forefront and be even more truthful, be even more ambitious. And we need to think through, what do we do then with this shared learning? How do we create the dots, the joined up dots, the bridges, the feedback loops that are necessary to have the impact that we actually need? This is why this futures thinking methodology is so important. To share insights about possible futures and building strategic foresight capacity, to understand that scenarios are not necessarily predictions, but they do enable us to see the future. Hence why the limits to growth is something that we're actually living today, 50 years later. We should have been able to already put in place the structural shifts that we needed then. And now our call is to do it today and not wait another day to do so. We cannot predict futures that we cannot explore without looking at different pathways to change. So anticipatory governance needs to be embedded throughout global governance in order to improve future and our foresight capacity, building resilience to future shocks and stresses, understanding that chaos is the new today, unfortunately. Being able to plan through chaos, being able to plan through continued crises. So I'm going to leave it at that, not on a depressing note, but actually leave you with what I feel are probably the most telling words from Jane Goodall, which is that we are the most intelligent species, but definitely not the wisest. I would therefore like to test us all. Let us prove Jane wrong. Let us demonstrate that actually we can be wise and intelligent. And I think Jane would be super happy if we could do that for her. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So nobody get up just yet. I know that's the tendency. Don't do it unless you're already up. So there are two things to explain. First is now we're gonna break out into these tracks. They are staggered. So that means you can enter 2 tracks, but that also means there's no lunch break. So if you want lunch, and I think you might, unless you're fasting, you can grab a sandwich there and bring it to either here. There are 2 rooms here, and then there are 2 at the Baha'i International Community's UN office, which you can see those 2 large buildings over there. And so consult your program to see which tracks you would like to go to and therefore which rooms. We are in the CCUN 10th floor, 2nd floor. 8 floors up is the 10th floor. That's how math works. And then both rooms are at the ground floor of the Baha'i International Community's office. So we have, again, 7 tracks, 4 and then 3. And then tomorrow we have 3 and then 4. They're staggered. And then the other thing, that was just thing 1. Thing 2 is that we're gonna do a group photo because you're so lovely, we can't not capture it. So I'm gonna turn over to Nudara, who has instructions on that.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for being so engaged throughout this. I have 2 things with regards to the photo. First, is you may have seen this device when you came into registrations and have questions about what this is. This is from our sponsors. If you press the button at the back, clip it to your phone, you can take a selfie and post it on Twitter and hashtag Torah. The second thing about this is that we're going to do a group photo, and I've been in conversation with Nabil, our amazing photographer. He said the best way to do it in this room is to line up between this wall and this column. So we're going to have our volunteers move these chairs. If you're sitting in one of these chairs, which I will be moved, kindly help us with this. And we're going to get Nabil to stand on this table and or on the chair because he refuses to stand on the table and take this group.
Well
So
done.
we could
Thank
do
you
that
so much.
quickly.
You're very
welcome. Thank
you so much for your work. I mean, this was good, but first of all, it's so wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm really hoping that we can integrate some of our thinking. We need to do that. We need to work together. You're very welcome.
I was writing credit. I'm with